Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Akkad and Coca Report. I'm Michel Akkad with you today, and I'm delighted to have on the show our guest, Charlie Deist. Um, Charlie will introduce himself in the course of the conversation, but I invited him because he's the author of a new book that came out a few months ago, the title of which is Hormetics, Physical Fitness for Free People. And Charlie will tell us about that. But the conversation, I think, will center around the questions of health. It's a little bit more philosophical, a book than you would expect to see when you have books about fitness and whatnot. So it's highly philosophical and at the same time extremely practical. I thought it was a terrific book. I've recommended it already to several friends and a couple of patients. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michelle. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you with me here. Uh, Tell us a little bit. So you start the book with your personal story. You didn't set out in life to become. I mean, I don't know if you would call yourself a fitness teacher or whatnot. But you have a little life story, which I think is important. I want to bring that angle because for me as a physician, it's actually quite important. To talk about this, to understand it a little bit better from you. What made you write this book, or what made you uh, um, get interested in these questions of health and nutrition and exercise and diet and that sort of thing?
Well, you're right that I didn't set out to become a health guru or professional, and I still, don't consider myself as such. I really just speak from my personal experience, not a medical professional, but the real story begins when I was a sophomore in college, and I had been on a vacation to Istanbul over spring break. And I came back with just a little bit of a tinge in my throat that blossomed into this illness that would really get the best of me over the course of the next couple of weeks. And then weeks turned into months, and I had recovered from some of the stronger symptoms. It really kind of knocked me flat for a while. But when I was looking for solutions to what was giving me this kind of chronic, these symptoms of just kind of constant fatigue, I kept going back to my doctor and looking for a concrete diagnosis, which he didn't have to offer. And eventually, after 3 negative tests for mono, he suggested that, well, maybe I just kind of lost the will to live. That was something that he had seen in his patients. And it just hit me that that was definitely a big part of what had happened over the course of this illness, just from being on my back and in bed for so long. It had taken something out of me that I needed to recover. So that's where it starts.
Okay, so he didn't want to label, or because we have labels now for illnesses such as you describe, chronic fatigue syndrome, and then there are different variations on the name,
Fibromyalgia.
fibromyalgia, and that sort of thing. Uh, and did you come across these diagnoses at the time in your research, or and your physician did not want to give you such a label or such a diagnosis, or?
I did, and I probably brought those to his attention, as if it was news. Uh, I bet you get people all the time who kind of come in with their list from Googling, and I'm curious what your kind of clinical perspective is on that. How well do people fare when it's just them and Google trying to self-diagnose? And I think that he was always one to talk me down from my wilder theories.
Mhm.
There was a time, this was my family doctor, so there was a time in high school when I had come back from Costa Rica with what turned out to be just an infected blister on my foot. But I was certain that it was leishmaniasis, this flesh-eating bacteria that could lead to amputation in the extreme, or at least a really. So I remember he told me, when you hear hoofbeats, don't look up and expect to see zebras. So he was always one to try to put some common sense
Right, right.
perspective.
That's good, but the um, I think it's wise of him to be sort of circumspect and not come up with labels. I mean, the labels actually betray our ignorance and our inability as physicians to help, generally speaking, with our usual tools, to help a lot of patients who have the kinds of symptoms that you describe. And the labels are primarily descriptive, right? Chronic fatigue syndrome. It's people who have as their dominant symptom chronic fatigue, but it doesn't tell us anything beyond that. And and then sometimes the label can imprison both the doctor and the patient into thinking about it in a certain way, and it may not be very constructive. I mean, I guess it depends. But but then he mentioned that thing about the will to live, which sounds like it's he thought that there might be either a psychological or even maybe a spiritual dimension to this, and then that sort of jogged you out of your mode of thinking.
Yeah, and there was also a recommendation that came with this. It wasn't all bad news. He also said that people who have these symptoms, he didn't call it chronic fatigue, but he just said that they tended to recover some of their strength when they gradually started to get back into gradual forms of exercise. And it was only recently that in Googling again, kind of chronic fatigue symptoms, just because it's become a curiosity having kind of come through the other side of it, and seeing that patients who've been diagnosed with long haul COVID, the tendency was to diagnose them with a kind of chronic fatigue and maybe prescribe graduated exercise therapy. And so I tried that and I had some success, but it wasn't a panacea, in that there's this balance where you exert yourself and you end up tired. So you don't want to get up and do it again. So you really have to find the right dosage as you're building back your stamina. And that was a whole process in and of itself, which really is the basis for the book Hormetics, which describes some of the practices that I found for gaining back your strength in ways that tie into your life's broader meaning and give you a sense of purpose and kind of help restore that will to live.
Right. So tell me a little bit about the term hermetics. I mean, I was sort of familiar with it. You just mentioned it. You sort of essentially describe what the idea is, but be a little bit more specific if you can, to tell us what hormesis. And did you essentially identify this as a good sort of therapeutic principle on your own, and then you recognized it as being promoted by others, or did you stumble upon somebody else who mentioned it?
There were a lot of thinkers that influenced me in this direction, a lot of them from the ancestral health community, or sometimes it's called paleo,
Hmm.
the paleo diet. And there's a whole philosophy of exercise that goes along with it that emphasizes things like outdoor movement and barefoot, these kinds of things that
Hmm.
introduce a certain kind of stress. And hormesis is a term that I think is most commonly used in pharmacology to describe this biphasic relationship where a stressor can be beneficial over a certain interval and then harmful later on, or the J-shaped curve,
Hmm.
where depending on where you fall, what the magnitude of the stress is, that determines whether it's harmful or beneficial. And so I use hormetics as kind of a new term, a neologism that, I mean, hormetic as an adjective is basically a stressor that follows this J-shaped curve. But hormetics I define as the art of optimal stress, or the art of beneficial stress. And you can find these helpful stressors all over the place, it turns out, once you start looking. And in a paleo framework, you might look at sort of sprinting, the proverbial chase, the hunt that the hunter gatherer would need to engage in, as a form of short term acute stress. And you can compare that to a lot of the chronic stresses that we have in modern life, where we're constantly stimulated. So it's trying to identify, good stress, bad stress, and get more good stress in our life.
Okay. So that's great. But so clearly there are these two central ideas. One is this hormesis, or the hermetics, or the stress, and the other one is the idea of um, kind of a return to a more I don't know if you want to say a more primitive state of, I mean, that something was lost somewhere along the, you know, the course of civilization, um, which, as you mentioned, is sort of popular in these paleo or ancestral health type things. Um, but I mean, a skeptic might say, listen, I mean, it's all, maybe we're romanticizing ancestral health, and I mean, what does it mean to be, that's, is that a mythical state of nature that we were under, or how? I mean, clearly, I don't know what the lifespan of a Neanderthal or somebody in those days, was, but clearly there have been, or there seems to be health benefits to civilization. We live longer. We do this. We do that. And then the concept of what's natural is kind of elusive. Do you have a way of sort of parsing that out, or?
Yeah, I look to, and again, to come back to some of my the thinkers that have influenced me the most. Nassim Taleb would be up there at the top of the list, and his concept of anti-fragility, or things that gain from disorder, was one of the primary influences for Hormetics. And I think Taleb identifies that technology is often at its best when it's invisible. So there are a lot of modern innovations that we can still embrace, like shoes, for example. I wear shoes. I'm wearing shoes right now. And even when I exercise, a lot of times I'll put on shoes if I'm going to be going over some rough and rocky terrain. If I'm walking around in the grass, I might kick off the shoes. But in general, having that extra layer of protection is a kind of an adaptation. And so I think that that's natural to human beings to create these innovations. But at the same time, we see where this goes wrong when we develop technology that sort of supplants the natural, or the kind of, I'll say, evolved function. With, to stick with the footwear example, we develop these shoes that have thick cushions, and the cushion prevents our foot from working the way that it's supposed to in a lot of ways if it's too thick. It's the same principle with football helmets in recent years that have added extra layers of cushioning. We get uh, even worse concussions in the NFL because the players are hitting each other so much harder. And when we run or walk with this thick cushioning, it might feel good on our foot, but we don't realize that up that chain on our knees and hips, we're actually allowing for more torque and force to go unnoticed that might cause injuries later on in life. So it's a double-edged sword with technology. As for the how you determine whether something is natural or not, I do think that, looking to what our ancestors have done is a good rule of thumb, but we always have to examine it more closely and whether we might be better off adopting some newer method.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I think it's pretty satisfying explanation. You're right. In your book, at several points, you talk about the N of one. I mean, each one of us, in a way, we're our own experiment. And but at the same time, there are some general rules that you offer. Um, when you let's say, let me give a more pointed example. You tend to be on the in your chapters on nutrition. The book is divided roughly into two parts. I mean, you have the beginning. The first part is mainly about diet and nutrition. The second part is more about movement and exercise and that sort of thing. On the nutrition side, you come more on the side. You're not, super dogmatic, but you come more on the side that um, a low carb diet is better. Meat is okay. Natural animal foods are okay, provided the animal has been raised under the proper conditions and is not filthy and all that stuff, and less on the side of somebody who would be more in favor of a more vegetarian diet and whatnot. But personally, I've encountered people who have, I mean, I know believers in the keto or paleo diets, and true believers in the vegetarian diets, and I can't really argue with either one of them, right? Or neither of these camps. I mean, they both seem quite healthy and satisfied and content with their choices. So how do you make the distinction, or how do you what do you think is going on there?
Right. So the n equals one experiment being meaning, each individual is their own kind of walking, living, breathing experiment. In my experience, after a lifetime of, or at least 21 years, which was the point at which I started to really need to address my nutrition because I got sick and needed to try something different. I had lived basically with the assumptions of the standard American diet, ice cream, pizza, hot dogs, hamburgers. And there's a lot of subtle distinctions in there. I like that you use the term true believers because I think that it points out the nature of a lot of dietary debates
Hmm.
being rooted largely in dogma. And there is a sort of new consensus, I think, emerging that uh, low fat has been a big mistake. That when we started advocating these alternatives to natural animal fats, we ended up with the unintended consequence of either loading foods up with more sugar to make them palatable or these kind of processed frankenfoods. So I think that there are certain principles where the conventional wisdom has gone off the rails, and I'm trying to bring it back to what are really ancestral principles, and not in the sense of cavemen, but also every traditional society that you can look at across the globe. There are very few societies that embrace something like vegetarianism just because of the nutrient density of meat and that combination of animal protein and animal fat providing just the basic building blocks for our health.
Hmm.
I try not to get too dogmatic and just give people a better understanding when it comes to macronutrients. So like ketogenic diets, I think can be a great sort of hack for someone who is trying to fix their metabolism. But it's not necessarily something that you need to follow for your entire life. If you're highly insulin resistant, then your body is in need of a kind of reset, a new equilibrium where you're capable of consuming fat and then using fat as your primary source of fuel. But if you have a basically healthy metabolism, I don't think there's anything wrong with trying different macronutrient ratios. And it all comes back to this idea of kind of the safe hormetic zone. To use that term hormesis as an adjective of hormetic, meaning finding the dose that makes the poison or the therapeutic uh, quantity. And so it's always something that I'm adjusting around the edges and trying to find a way to be flexible so that I don't have to turn down grandma's apple pie. And there can be a neurosis or a certain sort of
Right.
obsession with your ideology that, in a way, at least my experience has been, when you start to think, this food is healthy, this food is unhealthy. It's a bit like the old religious prohibitions on what foods were clean versus unclean, and just thinking it can make it so. So a lot of times, if I know that something has been cooked in the wrong kind of oil, which from a paleo perspective is all of the industrial seed oils, canola
Hmm.
oil, sunflower oil, these things that have been put through intensive industrial
Hmm.
processes to make them even edible, um, I'll start to feel sluggish, and probably if you told me, oh, this was cooked in butter, I would have no problem afterwards. So there is a psychological component.
Right, right. I imagine there is, which is inevitable. Speaking of, actually, I want to talk about this. You start the first chapter of your book deals with a little mental preparation, if you will, or spiritual preparation for all of this. You want to talk about that? Because I mean, on the one hand, the concept of hormesis seems kind of mechanical, right? I mean, you have a standard dose response curve, and you could presumably, and in fact, there are this is something that gets reproduced in the laboratory with chemicals and whatnot, and you take biological cells or and so forth, and you can get a U-shaped dose response curve. Um, so why is there a need to focus on what you talk about, which is training your willpower through some kind of discipline at the beginning?
Right. So the first chapter deals with the topics of prayer and fasting, which I think are neglected in a lot of the conversation around health. Fasting, people are starting to wake up to and recognize the benefits of going periods without eating. But prayer, which I look at as sort of like this cessation of activity, the cessation of striving after, that's something that uh, we're still maybe a little bit uncomfortable treating within any kind of a health or scientific perspective. And I don't even try to force it into that framework because I think that it really is kind of a separate category. But I think of willpower as our fundamental faculty for free choice, where counterintuitively the ability to discipline yourself is actually the highest form of freedom. And when it comes to embracing any of these uncomfortable sorts of stresses in your life, whether it's going a period without eating, skipping breakfast, or getting into the gym and lifting heavy things, or making yourself sprint or do exercise that, even if it's only a short period of time, it still is uncomfortable. I think that before you can do any of that, you have to uh, actually exercise your free will. And so prayer and fasting are the levers with which we can do that. And I think that this is where the spiritual component underlies a lot of people's, myself included, their issues with the will to live. So one other example, I talk about how prayer can kind of replenish your ability to experience desire. And fasting does the same thing with our appetite. But I think a lot of times we grow weary of joy. And that's paraphrasing a line from G.K. Chesterton,
Right.
that despair lies not in, it lies in being weary of good things. And so to regain that sense of appreciation, sometimes we just need to stop striving for a period.
Right. No, that's wonderful. Speaking of, you mentioned G.K. Chesterton. I mean, your book. I just listed a few kind of philosophical references that you have in passing. I mean, you're not heavy into philosophy, but your book, you have quotes from Paracelsus, from Vilfredo Pareto, from Nietzsche, from Thomas Merton, from Hippocrates, from the Gospel of Matthew, from Ludwig von Mises. I think it's uh, it's great, but it speaks to the thoughtfulness that you've put into this. Um, but to go back to this question of the will to live, I mean, I find it very fascinating. And do you have any thoughts on these three things? One of them is, that you've encountered, meaning the first one is an abrupt illness that seemed to have set you off track, right? And most of us, at least in the medical field, we would, and it's reinforced now with the long COVID syndromes that we see. We frequently invoke a prior viral illness, right, that eludes our ability to diagnose. Okay, so frequently people with chronic fatigue syndrome say, "Oh, it must have been some kind of virus that set you off, and somehow your immune system is out of whack and persists in that way." So there's that. There's the spiritual dimension, and then there's the lifestyle, nutritional, exercise dimension as well. Um, Now, if you, to what extent were you also unfortunate? I mean, could you have gone through life without? I mean, do you think you actually had a viral illness? I mean, do you think that was what set you off was actually an infection, some sort of infectious disease? And is it possible that you could have gone through life with the same lifestyle, essentially enjoying, and achieving whatever you needed to achieve, and enjoying your milestones and or whatever goals you had set for yourself? Uh, um, I mean, because frankly, I have patients in my clinic, and perhaps myself included. We don't have great lifestyles. It doesn't stop us from pursuing. We're not particularly unhappy. What are your thoughts? I mean, is it a vulnerability that we expose ourselves to when we don't have these lifestyle, and perhaps we can squeak by if we're lucky?
I do think that I had a virus, and whether it was mono or possibly even the more exotic seeming H1N1, which had
Mm,
been in places like Turkey, around the time that I was there. I don't know what it was ultimately, but I think that what prevented me from recovering was the precondition of poor nutrition, standard American diet. And even though I was relatively active, I had carried my long distance running habit from high school into college. I wasn't really deriving any joy from going to the gym or going out for long distance runs anymore. I think I did need some kind of a shot in the arm, or else I would have been on the trajectory of most Americans toward prediabetes, obesity, all these things that we file under the vague metabolic syndrome
Hmm.
category. And I think that I was relatively lucky in terms of my genetics to not be overweight and obese at that time. But I think that inside, what was starting to brew was this hormonal storm that eventually would have caught up with me. And I talked a little bit, I think, about insulin resistance, and I'm sure that I was on my way because I enjoyed, every treat under the sun, and orange juice and all these things that we might even think of as being healthy, but that tend to lead eventually to ourselves just saying that this is too much sugar. We can't handle all of this. So I'm glad that I took this trajectory. I'm glad that I had to consider my health more closely, because what I've come up with by necessity has been a much more vigorous lifestyle than I otherwise would have embraced. And that enables me to do other things and gives me a certain kind of freedom that I don't think I would have had if I had stayed on the proverbial treadmill.
Right. So let's talk about the joy component of this, because that reminds me that at some point in your book, I think when you introduce the question about, the section on physical activity, it kind of struck me that whereas in the diet, as the dietary section of the book, um, most of what you mentioned has to do with sort of objective health and achieving that with the proper nutrition and whatnot. When it comes to your physical activity section, um, it seems to me that at some uh, correct me if I'm wrong, but at some points it seems that you're saying that perhaps you can achieve the same thing by going to the gym, but the whole point here is to sort of liberate yourself from the what you call the zoo human, right? Being sort of enchained by these very repetitive, very contrived ways of very regimented ways of exercising and doing physical activity and whatnot, and you offer a way of sort of getting out of this. Um, so okay, you want to elaborate on that? I mean, that's obviously, I mean, it seems to be purposeful in your book, but where is the benefit in there to do this, to free yourself? I mean, there's almost a little bit of a political undertone here of being, unshackling yourself from the machine,
Right.
so to speak.
Not to get
Yeah.
too political, but I would say, paraphrasing a certain politician, if you like your gym, you can keep it.
Right.
President Obama, back in the days of Obamacare, said, if you like your healthcare, you can
Hmm.
keep it. And it was right around that time, actually. I was in college and following the political scene carefully. I didn't like what I was seeing in terms of what I perceived as the socialization of medicine. It seemed like there were just a lot of forces that were making it so that the people that were more successful would be sort of punished for their success. And after the passage of Obamacare, it kind of felt like, well, what's the point in really trying? So that actually, I didn't write about that in the book, but it did play in a little bit to this sense of losing the will to live, losing the will to really try. And so I had to come up with other motives for moving my body in ways that felt purposeful and meaningful. And I think you can get that from the gym to an extent. There are functional fitness exercises that you can do, or compound strength movements that are functional in a variety of different areas. Just being stronger makes you more useful, makes you more capable. But where I find that I really enjoy my, call it exercise, call it movement practice, is when I can draw a more direct connection between what I'm doing and how it makes my life better. So, for example, I enjoy climbing trees, and right now I was recording this from my boat on the Berkeley Marina at the Berkeley Marina. There are some great trees for climbing around here, but every once in a while I'll also need to climb up one of my a sailboat mast in order to retrieve something that's gone up to the top of the mast, or to install a wind vane or something like that. And having that strength to get up to the top of the mast is functional in the extreme. And so this is where I think that people can look at their own life and think about the areas where they need to be stronger specifically, and then focus their exercise activity on becoming more specialized in that area.
Most of us are lemmings. We are. All I need to strengthen is my fingers for my my keyboard. I spend, it's terrible. But but tell me what the I mean, you've given example. Give me other examples of what it looks like, and describe a little bit what you call the Movenet movement that you're essentially a part of. This natural method of motion and movement.
Sure. So Movenet is short for natural movement or movement in nature,
Mhm.
and it's based on the earlier writings and work of a French naval officer named Georges Hebert, who was stationed on a ship off the coast of Martinique during World War I, when a volcano erupted on the island, and several of his crew and he went to the island to try to help out with the rescue effort. And he found that only the people who were physically fit were useful in the rescue effort. And so he kind of combined this with some of his observations of the quote unquote primitive people. That's an anachronistic term, but it's the term that Hebert uses to describe people that were just strong by nature. They didn't go to the gym, they didn't do any compartmentalized exercises, but just in the course of everyday life in a more tribal environment, they would become very strong. And so this plays into the whole idea of how modernity and the excessive comforts that a technological civilization produces have made us weaker. One example is just grip strength. Since they started measuring it in the 80s, there's been a significant decline among teenagers in their grip strength. And this is closely correlated with life expectancy. I'm not sure why that is, but it seems worth noting that as our strength declines, other areas that we all recognize as being important for quality of life also decline with it. So we want to recover what was lost without giving up all of the benefits of modernity. And Movenet is a way of going back to sort of our primal nature in terms of the full range of natural human movements, from running to climbing. Swimming is one of my favorite activities. And you asked for some other examples. I think that breathing is one of the areas where we can reconnect to our bodies in a more natural way. Breathing is a natural movement that I read. I don't even really believe the statistic, but that we take somewhere around twice as many breaths as people did 80 years ago.
Hmm.
We're breathing faster. We might be overstimulated. And so taking the time to learn to breathe more diaphragmatically, breathing into our belly and using the muscles of our diaphragm to open and close our lungs. These are ways to just center yourself, and it kind of ties in with the whole mindfulness movement. And I think that whether you consider it meditation or prayer, these are ways that we can, even if we're not engaged in particularly demanding activities in our daily life, we can use natural movement to our advantage.
Is there a social aspect of this? I mean, can you do are there group activities, or are there? I think you have a meetup group. If I saw that on your website, and are these available sort of across the country, different places?
There aren't as many groups as I would like to see, especially the Movenet organization. They certify trainers in the techniques, and the techniques can be practiced in isolation. But you're right. I do have a group here in Berkeley that meets on every Saturday down at the Berkeley Marina. And one of the ways that we get more people involved in it is just with different games. But the original La Method Naturelle, this is sort of a little bit of your old stomping ground. Movenet itself actually comes from was founded by a, a French man named Erwan Lacour, but the precursor of the natural method, or La Method Naturelle, created by Georges Hebert, was designed to lead large groups of naval recruits through these functional exercises at the same time. And so he would set up either obstacle courses, or if they didn't have a natural obstacle course, they might create sort of a field or a course. I'm working on a translation of a training manual for instructors in the natural method, and he describes it as it's kind of funny trying to find the exact English word, but basically it's like a pitch, or that might be the British term, a field where people are moving down from the starting point to the finish point, doing everything from sprinting to crawling. And this was a more effective way to train people en masse and get them in shape for military preparedness than the other methods of stationary exercises. You might think like, jumping jacks or push-ups, sit-ups. You actually get more fit by getting your whole body involved and physically relocating yourself.
Right. Is there a sex bias? Is this mainly for men, or so for most appealing to men, or what's your take on this?
We have a very even breakdown actually in the meetup group. And I think when it was considered more narrowly as military training, it was aimed obviously more at men. But in the later part of Hebert's life, he started to extend this to women. He wrote a couple of books about training for women, and got even the whole family involved. And he liked the idea of there were communities that were springing up throughout France and throughout Europe that were putting his ideas into practice in a communal setting with people of all ages, and men and women.
Okay. Two questions. Is there much of self? I didn't get in the sense in the book that you. There's much about the self. What's the term for the self measurements? When people measure. Um, there's a term for it. Sorry, I'm blanking out. When people use all kinds of metrics and measure all kinds of metrics and follow the metrics for their own health, measuring
Quantified self.
Quantified self, exactly. The quantified self. What's your take on the quantified? It doesn't seem to be, that's something that I tend to be a little bit skeptical of, that it can become a bit of an obsession.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it makes me think a little bit of Ivan Illich, who I know you've done a podcast recently on his thought. And I think that one of the trends that he began to see was a kind of obsession with these metrics, and that you would have, in a way, someone tasked with managing your health, or that the metric would come to replace our body's innate wisdom in knowing both how to heal itself, but also just knowing sort of what it needs. And I think with counting calories, this is a trend that that we see, where I'm glad that I found kind of a combination of foods that does not require me to obsessively count calories. There are other ways, I think, to other feedback mechanisms that we can rely on. But that's a great question, and I haven't actually thought all that much about it, except that my instinct is to be skeptical as well. I'm not sure exactly why that is. Do you have any other thoughts?
No, I mean it's that's primarily it, that people start to focus. I think it seems to me disproportionately on the numbers, and they seem to drive their attention, and they're unhappy if they don't hit the numbers that they think they should be hitting or achieving, and that sort of thing. Because more generally, then that would be the second point. More generally, there's always, even if you don't, even if you take out the quantifying aspect of things away, um, I mean, health can be an unhealthy preoccupation,
Hmm.
right? I mean, we can be a little. I mean, it's self-centered, and it can be a little obsessive to achieve perfect health, especially since, I mean, I don't think you claim the contrary, but we're all going to decline at some point, right? I mean, there's a limit, a ceiling to how healthy we can be. We can have a healthy decline or a non-healthy decline, but nevertheless, there is a decline, and therefore there's a wiser way to think about health, and an unwise way. And so how do you advise people to navigate this as well, or do you, or
Wow, great question. And I think about the metrics that matter most in you know I- body weight, for example, is something that I think of as being very much secondary to your ability to move freely. And there's one metric that uh, I encountered recently that I thought, well, that would be interesting. I'd kind of like to get that done, which is this measure of, I think it's sort of a measure of insulin sensitivity, where you take your fasting blood glucose and then take it again after maybe some eating something. Or but the I'm curious if you've ever used, what tests in your practice you find to be of the most value, and if you use anything like that to determine whether people are starting off from a place, because some of them I can see being useful to just kind of get a baseline sense of where people
right?
are coming
Y-
from and how they
y-
can live longer. I do take living longer to be a good thing, but it's certainly not the only thing.
Right. It's a very difficult question. It's a great question. I struggle with this all the time because one part of me wants to say a lot of what we measure is really artificial, and we really shouldn't be measuring lipid levels, cholesterol level. People should come to the doctor if they really have a problem in their, presumably in their physical life. I mean, if they have marital problems, they can come to me also. But I may not be the best. But generally speaking, I mean, the role of a physician has to do with the health of the body, and you're right to focus on the functional aspect of our body. I mean, is our body allowing us to function properly? Um, which is a complicated question because our social lives are not healthy to begin with. So they may, and we sit at our desk and so forth. So we may be able to get by to do our work, but but there's some sense where it doesn't seem right. But in terms of measuring things, so I measure things just because it's sort of cultural. It's kind of cultural for people when they come to see me that we check, the chemistries and check the lipid panel and check the hemoglobin A1C and check this and check that and do some cancer screening. And I can't say that it's always fruitless. I mean, there may be times. I mean, I have actually an example of a patient who is very healthy as far as I can tell. I mean, he's physically active. Enjoys life. His lifestyle is, as far as I can tell, has nothing wrong with it. I mean, there's nothing that I would, and and yet he's not overweight. Yet he seems to have insulin resistance, right? So he has a high hemoglobin A1C. His fasting glucose is a little bit higher than it should be. Triglycerides level are a little bit higher than they ought to be. If you look at, there's fatty liver on the ultrasound, that sort of thing. So it's very puzzling, and so now we're trying to correct this, but we would never have known it if it weren't for the fact that we had measured these things. And I'm hoping that the correction will not, it's not going to be too onerous on him, or introduce sort of anxieties and whatnot, and that um so it's a good question. I don't have a good answer. I don't say that I'm consistent about it. I kind of go with the flow of what the medical culture tends to be. I have my own particular style and preferences. I tend to be a minimalist in general. I don't tend to order a gazillion tests as opposed to others. And I try to downplay little abnormalities, even on the blood glucose and things like that. Again, putting it into the context of the person that I'm dealing with, because I may have people who I'm dealing with, who may not be in the mental state that you described. They may not have even come to the point where making significant lifestyle changes is going to be uh, uh, in the cards for them, either because of external circumstances or internally they're not prepared, that sort of thing. So there's no general rule, but it's a good question. So I don't have any particular, just what the standard medical culture uh, says. I do check things like maybe more liberally imaging for cardiovascular health, for vascular health. I mean, you can detect things that perhaps you might not be detecting otherwise. But even then, if on the surface the patient is if the patient is not, if the person is not asking me to look for anything or asking for trouble, I try to stay away from measuring or looking below the surface if I can. And I'd rather take the risk of missing something rather than take the risk of looking more deeply and then focusing the attention on certain metrics and certain things that in the end either they're not going to affect the person, because people can live with insulin resistance for a long time and then get run over by a bus, right? So and so it's I don't think there's really any formal rule to follow. There are general principles which you describe in your book, but there's no formality or formal rule that I follow.
Interesting. Yeah, and I try to paint with a fairly broad brush, or stick to the topics that I'm the most certain of in terms of being. I don't want to just repeat what is conventional wisdom, so I try to also focus on things that maybe are a little bit contrarian. For example, getting sufficient sunlight. And this is something where there's been a little bit of a push towards sunscreen and staying out of the sun. But if you really dig into the data, you find that even people who develop some of these kinds, even people that develop skin cancer, even people that develop the most deadly kind of skin cancer, often live longer the more sun exposure they continue to get.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that's a very good point, and I'm perfectly willing to believe that line of argument as well. I mean, I think clearly we've seen, and as you describe, and others have described as well, in terms of the standard dietary advice that we've received, for 30 years, it turned out to have been pretty misguided. And so I'm sure there are many other things that remain part of the standard wisdom, or the received wisdom, that should be called into question. Including, I agree with you, sunscreen. I hardly ever wear it myself. I'm very fair skinned. At the same time, I don't spend much time as much time as I should in the sun. Um, but yeah. So nature is just a general teacher. You call nature a teacher in the book, following others. I think it's correct. Properly understood, with wisdom that is not always natural. But that
Sometimes
can be
supernatural.
supernatural and can be cultivated if for people of goodwill. Um, what This is great. I really want to encourage people. I mean, I'm not a guy that is into the fitness and health literature, but I really enjoyed your book very, very much. As I said, we haven't really touched on the many different hacks or little practical tips that you have, but you have many of them for a number of different things, and I would like to apply them to my own life. I really do. One of these days, I will come to a place where I can do this. And so I'm gonna tell us where people can follow you, Charlie. You blog as well. I mean, you do more than just writing this book and being a fitness guru. You want to tell us a little bit about what else you do? You have a
Fitness
podcast,
non-guru.
fitness non-guru.
Yeah, I like the motto: become a teacher, but remain a student. That's something that I got from Erwan Lacour, the founder of Movenet.
Hmm.
And my journey has been one of really sort of faith-seeking understanding. I wasn't actually a person of faith when I became sick, and it took several years before actually figuring out what faith meant in a more concrete sense. But just by virtue of needing to find some answers that were not part of the conventional paradigm led me to knock on a lot of different doors. I blog at anaturalmethod.com, so taking the La Method Naturelle and not suggesting that there is one single natural method that will work for everyone, but this is a natural method
Hmm.
that's worked for me in my recovery journey. And the book is on Amazon. I am on most of the usual social media platforms, but the website would be the main place to find my work to keep
Great.
up.
And I'll have a link to your book and your website on the show notes at karenkoka.com. Charlie, thank you very much. It was terrific.
Thank you, Michelle. It's been a
Okay.
pleasure.
Take care.